It's my enormous privilege and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker and tell you a little bit about why he's here with us today. Harvey Fineberg is the president of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. I met him 2 years ago, thanks to Mark Schwartz. Mark, where are you? Just raise your hand. Mark got to know Harvey in his stint at Washington, and I managed to get Harvey to lead the advisory committee for our National Evolutionary Synthesis Center work group on evolution and medicine. It's not as if Harvey Fineberg is mainly an evolutionary medicine person, but he's mainly is a deep thinker and an amazingly sophisticated he has this way of giving you one or two sentences that make you think you've just heard about an hour's lecture and have thought about it. In particular, he had a role in creating this society that I think is seminal. There was one time when we were talking about, well, we've got a foundation. People have been asking Randy and others for about 10 years, please form a society. We need a society. But it's a lot of work to form a society, and we were kind of going on that way. And Harvey, in his inimitable way, said very quietly, you know, it walks like a duck. It quacks like a duck. You want to organize meetings. It's a society. Why don't you just call it a society? And all of us, I think, at that very moment decided, okay, it's time to really do this. And it's thanks to his two-sentence intervention that we are all here today. So much has come from that. He had a lot of other very good advice from us. I think I can say this safely, Harvey, that when we were talking about strategies for actually influencing medical schools, he had the sage advice of saying, don't try to frontal assault. They're stronger than you are. They'll never, ever actually bend. You need guerrilla strategies to actually get into medical schools. And there's much more like that. His background makes him uniquely suited to give advice of all kinds, and it's been welcomed all across the world. He's really one of the world's not only most distinguished physicians, but most distinguished leaders in general. As president of the Institute of Medicine, he led all kinds of initiatives that really have brought science to medicine in ways that were not done before. Prior to that, he was provost of Harvard University. Prior to that, he was the dean of public health. Prior to that, he got a PhD after his MD in government, of all things, and that's what he's been really doing, is helping people create strategies for governance that really work. But most important, before any of that, he actually practiced medicine for 10 years in the Boston area. With this wealth of background and these insightful comments, we've invited him here to help guide us in where we've come from and thoughts about where this whole enterprise of ours can go. Harvey, welcome.
Randy, thank you so very much for that overly generous, some might even say grotesquely generous introduction. I couldn't help but think, well, if one sentence could make it seem like it was 45 minutes, could 45 minutes seem like 10 hours of sitting and listening? I hope not. I think it would be better if we all came to the conclusion after the next half hour or so that, gosh, it seemed like only a minute flew by. But that would require Baba Brinkman up here and not me. Do you all know who that is? No. Baba, stand up for just a minute, because you're going to hear from Baba later on. I don't want to steal his thunder. I won't even tell you what he's done, but what he has done is nothing short of the most extraordinary mechanism for conveying information to audiences who otherwise would never listen to two whole sentences you would say to them. So how's that for an introduction? All right. So we're looking forward to that later on. I have to say my introduction to the ideas of evolution came when I went to college. Because when I was in high school, I actually never actually took a biology course. I had studied lots of math, I had done physics, I had done chemistry, but with all that was packed in, I just never got around to biology. So I started in my freshman year to enroll in biology because I thought that might be an interesting way to round out my exposure to the basic sciences, at least as I was interested in them. My instructor was a fellow named George Wald. George Wald was a very renowned expert in vision. He had won the Nobel Prize for his work on vitamin A and receptors. And in the course of his lectures, he pointed out a very interesting phenomena. He observed that if you think of it historically and phylogenetically, that the idea of sexual reproduction enters life at the same time that death of the soma applies to life. If you have a single-celled organism, it divides. Theoretically, it can just keep going on forever. But if you have a more complex organism, which separates the soma and the genome goes on, and the soma stops. Now, I have to tell you, as a college freshman, the trade-off between death and sex was a close call. But over the years, I have actually come to think that it's maybe not worth it. In fact, we don't know for sure, but it raises a very fundamental point of distinction between the purposes of medicine and the force of evolution. Because from an evolutionary point of view, what matters is extending the genome from one generation to the next. So think of it like your body is the booster rocket. You send the genomic payload into orbit, and then the rocket falls down into the ocean and disappears. Well, we might fall down to Earth and disappear, but you get the idea. So fundamentally, when you begin to think of it this way, the purpose of medicine, which is to preserve life and the soma, is at least tangential, if not diametrically opposite, to the force of evolution, of extending the genome. And that introduces a very interesting tension for everyone who is interested in the intersection of evolution and medicine. And I have to say that I am here because I am so thrilled by the idea that this society has taken shape. And not only that it has begun, but has begun with all of you here. How many of you actually signed up to be members?
They can't until Saturday.
How many plan to sign up to be members? Most everybody. I think the dues may have to lower a little bit apparently, but you get the last 3 people who weren't ready. But I would say it is so exciting to see the beginnings of this relationship formalized in the mechanism of an ongoing society. You know, in some sense, if medicine inverts the means and ends of evolution, where in evolution the soma is the means to preserve the genome, and in medicine we take genomic information, genetic endowment, as one of the determinants of our ability to live long and healthy lives. If they have inverted the two, how is it that we can bring them into juxtaposition? I can tell you, if you haven't already discovered it, that it is not an easy or simple task, and not only because of these principles, because of a number of the kind of obstacles or challenges that I understand you've already talked about, that you will find in medicine in thinking about the role of evolution. I can tell you, for example, I just learned from Dr. Leonard Marcus that very recently the Massachusetts Medical Society came to reject a proposition that evolution was central to clinical medicine and was an essential part of education for doctors in training. Now, you may give them the benefit of the doubt to say, well, of course, maybe they just didn't want to make anything an essential part, a required part, and to begin to dictate to medical schools what is or is not determined. And that reinforces that point about guerrilla action as opposed to frontal assaults, I would say. But even in informed and enlightened areas, there's not a universal readiness to see the connection and the significance of evolutionary thinking in medical training and in medical practice. It gets worse, however. There's a member of the United States House of Representatives who is a physician, who is Paul Brown of Georgia, and he said in the year 2012, and I'm going to read it so that I quote him accurately, "All that stuff I was taught about evolution and embryology and the Big Bang Theory, all that is lies from the pit of hell," unquote. Now, it may seem comical and farcical, but the reality is this is a reflection of the starting point of belief and expectation and orientation of a significant segment of the American public. And it's not unknown amongst our profession if we are talking about medicine. So the challenges are substantial today. In fact, Darwin himself, in his life, had a kind of approach-avoidance relationship to medicine. Charles Darwin had a father, Robert, who was a physician and a prosperous businessman at the time in Victorian England. The young Charles was somewhat an indifferent student. He failed to distinguish himself academically in any way, and his father once famously observed that Charles is, quote, "rather below the common standards in intellect," unquote. I think that should be a great source of reassurance to any of us who ever received a C or a D on any of our report cards. At one point, the father wrote to the son and said, "You will be a disgrace to yourself and your family," unquote. I think that passes for tough love in the Victorian age. Well, Charles, as an unpromising youth, was therefore sent off to medical school in Edinburgh at age 16, where he lasted about 2 years before they dismissed him. He came back to attend to the last refuge of respectable profession, the clergy. Admitted to Cambridge, but failed to attend almost any classes and spent his time riding horses, drinking, gambling, and cavorting with the wrong sort of company. Now, Darwin's interest in the natural world was prompted not by anything he learned in class. It was prompted by observation in the field, in the company of some of the most renowned experts of the day in geology, in botany, in entomology. And these real-life experiences inspired Darwin to the point that he signed on for the famous voyage of the Beagle, the fateful voyage that laid the foundation for what became his theory of evolution. Now, in that course of that travel, Darwin actually contracted a chronic ailment, which is mysterious to this day. Perhaps some speculate it was Chagas disease in Brazil, but he was afflicted by this for the rest of his life. A friend once observed that visiting the Darwin household, it was, quote, "a distinction and a mournful pleasure to be ill." He relished his ailment. And he once observed late in life that although it has annihilated several years of my life, it has saved me from the distractions of society and its amusements. So there is a person whom we revere, who overcame disadvantages of youthful non-education, criticism by his own family, chronic illness, to craft what is arguably the foundation for all that followed in biology. Darwin, in my mind, was extraordinary not because of brilliant insight in a moment, but because he had a quality of tenacity of mind. He could grip a problem and stay with it until he had satisfactorily wrestled it to the ground and solved that complexity to his satisfaction. And the result is what we all now know as theory of evolution. Interestingly, I think he shared that trait with a contemporary, actually someone born the same day as Darwin, President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln also had that quality of tenacity of mind and his ability to stay with the problem until the end. But during this time, in the mid-19th century, when Darwin was grappling with the data and Lincoln was dealing with a country that had riven apart. In the decade before, John Snow in England was coping with an outbreak of cholera in London. And it was John Snow's work around that time in London that laid the foundations for public health, because he assembled data and he did a geographic assessment of the locations of cases and documented their proximity to the pump, the Broad Street pump. And it was because of his observations, followed by action to remove the pump, remove the handle, that the epidemic was brought to a conclusion. Now, in science, our fundamental goal is to understand nature and its expression, where evolution is such an exemplary illustration. In medicine or in public health, our aim is to make a positive difference in people's lives. So where does understanding and making a positive difference come together, and where do they diverge? The first and most obvious reality for how evolution is fundamental to medicine or public health or veterinary medicine, or, if you will, agriculture, is the fact that the principles of understanding particular problems cannot be persuasive without an understanding and a grounding in evolution. It is not really possible to think comprehensively about something like antimicrobial resistance without understanding principles of natural selection and evolution. Secondly, in medicine and in public health, what evolution brings to the field is a framework to allow an understanding of the basic structures and functions of the human body, or the animal body, or the plant. It is impossible otherwise to understand wisdom teeth. You can't explain the appendix. Why are there two nerves to the middle ear? And the famous example that was put forward as an illustration of why humans had to be by design, the human eye, is actually a very awkward solution. If you were designing an eye, why would you put the receptors behind several layers of cell? You can only understand the ultimate structure of the eye if you also think of it and understand it in evolutionary terms. So fundamentally, without evolutionary principles, we don't have an adequate framework to understand the basic biology and physiology of the body. Thirdly, evolution gives us principles to deal with more fundamental origins of disease and understanding and a way of apprehending a multiplicity of factors that influence our state of health. In evolutionary terms, we can think about a problem like obesity, and indeed there are a number of presentations at this meeting on a problem like obesity, and think of it in evolutionary terms in terms of selection and function as served by our ability to store excess calories. It relates to concepts of vulnerability and resilience in humans and in animals. When we think about the perverse effects of anxiety, but also the desired effects of anxiety, it is possible to understand the balance most clearly also, I would submit, in evolutionary terms. You know, if you are subject to predation, an error which is a false positive, thinking the predator is there when it's not, is not nearly so damaging as a false negative, which is thinking the predator is not there when in fact it is. So evolution would select for propensity to avoid the danger, not in an even-handed way of making balanced judgment, but in overly reacting when the danger might be present, because the penalty for error is ever so much greater if you make the error of the false positive. Now, a fundamental question for the society, I think, going forward, is to confront the long-standing challenge of whether medicine and evolution are in fact not merely tangential in their purpose, but possibly antithetical. Does medicine, by preserving life, and particularly enabling individuals to reproduce in times when they are otherwise would be lost, does that alter the genomic mix of the population in a way that is adverse? That's the challenge. It's not a new question. It's a very old question. It's not a question even that relates simply to medicine. I noticed that there's a paper that's being discussed or presented on shoes. Who's doing the paper on shoes? Okay. It turns out, according to the abstract, that if you're barefoot, is this true? You're merely embarrassed without my giving the entire story? That barefoot populations tend over time to have stronger arches than those who are shod. Is that a fair summary in one sentence? Good, thank you. Now, does this mean that we are perversely selecting for a propensity for flat-footedness? That's not a medical intervention, it's an environmental intervention. But every species that's capable, most particularly humans, has always adapted its environment to improve its ability to survive. Every species has done that, and humans have done it with the greatest success of all, from the point of view of controlling our environment. Yes, we are now at a point where we may have sown the seeds of our own environmental undermining through climate change, but along the way, we have created campuses like this. We've created institutions. We've created cities. We've created residences and protected places that nourish the human spirit and that preserve the human body. We've controlled our environment. So is medicine fundamentally different than any other control of the environment? I would submit, at least as a way of thinking and to provoke thinking, that when you introduce medicine, just as when you introduce shoes, just as when you introduce central heating, all is a manipulation of the environment with the intent of survival, and each fundamentally alters the environment in which we then exist. Does the fact of eyeglasses and other corrective surgery mean that it is no longer a selective disadvantage to the same degree to be nearsighted or farsighted? It does. Does that mean that we are having a greater propensity over time for nearsightedness because we're protecting the ability of those who are nearsighted to avoid danger? Perhaps. But it's a part of our environment that we have introduced. And in the same way, all of medical intervention, I would submit, for the purposes we introduce it, are a part of making our environment more suited to our future survival. Now, evolution clearly has not culminated in the appearance of Homo sapiens. Evolutionary processes continue. We don't know the direction. We don't know exactly what will be the next level, but it would be the height of pride to imagine that we are the pinnacle that evolution could ever produce. So, if we've learned anything from evolution, we've learned that survival is not to the most intelligent or the swiftest or the one who is strongest or the one who has greater flexibility. Rather, survival is solely due to the species most fit to the environment. Now, if it creates its environment, it also creates the conditions under which it can survive. And there is admittedly a kind of tautology in the definition, because if the evidence of fitness is the fact of survival, and the reason for survival is that you are fit, then there's a circularity to the argument. But that is the theory. And that circularity does not deter us from working toward an improved environment to encourage our fitness. But what is the future? What is it that we might do even more beyond what we have done to make the environment and our fitness more suited to one another? At this point in our history, technologically, scientifically, we're at the cusp of a new era in which it is possible to intervene genomically in ways that never were imaginable in past generations. And when a thinker like Marc Lalonde, who was a former Minister of Health of Canada, articulated the determinants of health, he said, well, there are behaviors, and there's environment, and there's health intervention, and there's genetics. And genetics at the time was the given, and all of the others were potentially manipulable. But what if the genetics, at least of our somatic cells, also becomes manipulable, changeable over time, either directly or indirectly? And then what if we have the potential ultimately to also alter our genomic cells, which means not only affecting our fitness or lack of it to the environment, but the next generations? These are very profoundly challenging questions for anyone who is working at the intersection of medicine and evolution. And I would submit that we have to be very mindful of history to make sensible choices going forward. History that is not a very attractive history, of a history of a eugenics movement. A movement which said, you can decide for me what best attributes I have that suit your vision of society. And that proved to be catastrophic at every level. And it was a widespread belief, not only in the Nazi era, but building up over decades amongst very respectable leaders in countries all over the developed world. The difference going forward, I would submit, is that individuals have to be the ones in control of their own choices about their own personal destinies, and not others making choices for us or for a third party. How to arrange that, how to ensure it, how to protect the rights of privacy going forward, this is going to be another core challenge to the field. The field is at an exciting, nascent period. It's a time when medicine and public health and veterinary medicine all have a common stake in the connection between evolution and learning, evolution and clinical practice, evolution and research. And you are in the vanguard. You are the ones coming together for the purpose of ensuring that this intersection will have its rightful place in the future of clinical practice, in the future of biomedical research, in the future of social decision-making. I salute you, I congratulate you, and I look forward to your comments, your questions, and to the presentations through the time that I can be with you. Thank you all very much for having me here. So I think the floor is open for questions? Absolutely. Okay.
Gil Oman. Harvey, lovely talk.
Thank you.
Of course, this society is called Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health.
Yes.
So much of your exposition was about individuals and individual decision-making. Maybe you'd like to elaborate some of the population-based approach and context as well.
Well, thank you, Gil, for the question. When we think about evolution and understanding of the basis of illness, the causes of disease, the complexity of disease, that's fundamentally a population health question, because it's understanding not only the appearance of a disease in an individual, but also the distribution of disease and the appearance of disease in a population. So the whole problem of emergent infections, as an example, the questions about movement of disease, the reasons why some conditions are, if you will, more prevalent at one time and less prevalent at another, whether it's myocardial infarction, rheumatic heart disease, any number of conditions that have diminished, or conditions like Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases which are on the ascent. So understanding those phenomena, I believe, is greatly enhanced by evolutionary understanding and evolutionary principles. In public health, of course, we're also concerned about the intersection of population health of humans and veterinary medicine and the health of animals and also plants and their well-being. So the concepts of One Health, which embrace public health and medicine and veterinary medicine, I think are also not only germane but fundamental to evolutionary medicine, evolutionary thinking, and the future of medicine, as well as public health. So those are a couple of examples. Thank you. Yes? Oh, sorry, wherever the microphone is.
Yes, and if you can make sure that you talk.
Oh, am I not audible?
No.
No. Okay, is this better?
That's better.
Okay, I'll stay right here.
Thank you.
Please.
I recently heard a presentation by your successor, the Institute of Medicine, and about what they might do in the future.
Yeah.
And someone brought up the problem of scientific misinformation and other kinds of issues in the American public. And the answer seemed to be that that was not the direction that the Institute might take. So my question is, when it comes to this issue of evolution in medicine and evolution in general, do you think that this is a case where, again, you shouldn't take the frontal assault using major institutions and rather take the guerrilla approach?
Not at all. In fact, I would say if you look at the work of the national academies generally, National Academy of Sciences with the Institute of Medicine in the past, on the general question of evolution, there's been a concerted effort to articulate and to re-articulate the core principles of evolution in a way that is digestible to the public. And this effort resulted in a series of publications, which is what the organizations tend to do, but directed to the public at large, not to the science community or the professions. You raise a very important point in a lot of ways, though, because I believe that in the end, if we don't have public understanding of what we are dealing with in evolution, then we are constantly in jeopardy of losing support and at working at cross purposes to other public interests. So I would say from a vantage point of a new society devoted to the intersection of evolution and medicine and public health, that educating the public about evolution and its implications would be one of those elements that personally I would favor as a role and a responsibility that a society would undertake. If we don't do it, who is going to do it? Who will educate the public about evolution? And it has to start, of course, with schools, and there are many assaults on evolutionary teaching in schools, as we know. But that is a responsibility of the community of scientists and physicians and other clinicians and veterinary medicine specialists, all who work in these fields, to play their part in working to enhance public understanding and appreciation of the power of evolution. You know, Dobzhansky, the renowned geneticist in the last century, observed that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And we have to be able to convey that to the public. Yes, sir.
A little over 5 years ago, the American Medical Association, the American Veterinary Medical Association, excuse me, and the American Public Health Association began an effort to join their respective interests in the One Health Initiative. And I was a member of that task force and tried to bring up the concept that none of this One Health would be possible or make sense except within the concept of evolution. This was resoundingly put down in the interests of a united front and developing programs that would get financial support. And myself, I am both a veterinarian and physician, and there was one other such person with that background who was a fundamentalist Christian believer in biblical verbatim truth, and he prevailed. And I would suggest to the audience, first of all, that this, more than anything I can imagine, shows you the challenge that is out there when the One Health Initiative that you think instinctively would be evolutionary based rejects it, and that they have a newsletter out of the University of Florida, and if you people contribute articles to that newsletter, it may help change this thing around. But I think it's a major conceptual idea. The One Health Initiative certainly should be evolutionary based.
Well, thank you, Leonard, for your comment. There's no doubt in my mind that since each of the components, human medicine, animal medicine, public health, is intimately connected with evolution, the juncture of them is even more so. So I think it is a fundamental tenet of evolution and its implications. At the same time, if you want to be successful in reaching people, you have to meet them where they are. You have to appreciate the core of their beliefs and the foundations on which are important to them. For that reason, for example, the work that was assembled under the National Academies is very, very sympathetic to the importance of religious beliefs, because you can be utterly religious and still completely understanding and appreciating the importance of evolution. And that cannot be a contradiction. And if we can, we have to help people, enable them to see how that can be compatible in their own lives. When you have someone like Francis Collins, who, head of the National Institutes of Health, who can proclaim and write about the depth of his religious convictions and the importance of them to him, I think it demonstrates again that these are not incompatible ideals, and we have to be able to accommodate everyone who is prepared to work in favor of better medicine, better public health, and incorporate the knowledge and judgment as well as understanding that comes from evolutionary principles. Yes?
I have a slightly different view, and I'm aware of Collins's positions, but I remember the document from the National Academy that came out some years ago addressing evolution and its compatibility with religion, and I think they fudged a bit in that while there certainly are instances of devout religious believers who accept evolution nominally, in some cases what they accept is not really what most of the people in this room would regard as the actual substance of evolutionary science. I had a specific example in my own experience with a rabbi who gave a sermon which, without his realizing it, was basically intelligent design. And when I tried to point this out to him, he was not receptive. And I would just say that the notion that science and religion cannot conflict is simply historically incorrect. There is an enormously complex relationship. I don't dispute that religion, including the Roman Catholic Church, have at times been incredibly supportive of science, but also sometimes with an ulterior motive and a specific agenda. So it's not a simple matter, and I think it presents an enormous challenge to people of goodwill to confront that without irritating some of the people in the general public you're trying to reach, because it's not a simple argument if you want to stay true to the historical facts as best as they can be discerned.
Well, first, I accept your points. I wasn't saying there's no conflict historically or possible. That was not my assertion. What I really do believe is that if you want to communicate successfully with anyone, you have to bend over backwards to understand what their starting point is. That goes in both directions. And I think from that premise, we could then have a fruitful discussion of what then does one do. And indeed, I think that's a discussion that ought to occupy some portion of time for the society over time, because it's not an easy problem. On that, I certainly also would agree with you. But it is a reality in our society and around the world, and it is something that, again, because it does matter that there is public understanding, it's important for us to face up to it. And I think that how we do it over time, in what specific mechanisms and ways, that's something we've got to continue to work on. A final question or comment? Yes, please.
I wanted to
Yeah.
just sort of apropos the current conversation. It seems to me like one of the main goals of medicine is really caring for the sick and the weak, and we find more and more complicated and expensive ways of doing that, but ultimately the goal is really coming from compassion, and that's a principle that's also important in many religions and spiritual practices. So I think there may be more of an alignment of interests there if you really go to the fundamental heart of the motivation for engaging in medicine. So I was hoping maybe you could speak to that briefly.
Well, Thank you for the comment. It's a really important point. It is clear to anyone, I think, that the motive of caring is at the heart of success in any clinical relationship. And the idea that you can practice compassionate care only if you are born compassionate, I do not accept. I believe that we can learn also to be more compassionate. And I think one of the obligations of education in medicine, in contrast to what it sometimes seems to do, which is to negate the innate compassion that we bring to the beginnings of medical education and practice. Instead, we should be nurturing, reinforcing, and enlarging that sense of compassion. If that can also provide a common ground for understanding complete care of the patient, including the physical and spiritual aspects of their needs, I think it's all to the good. And I thank you very much for the reminder. Thank you all very much.